Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning into the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that you return for future episodes and new content. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back. And I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get into the main event, as always, I ask that if you're on YouTube, make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes of this podcast. You could also check out past episodes of the podcast on our website, identitytalk4educators.com. And if you're listening from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of those audio platforms, make sure you subscribe there as well. Now, for those who have asked me, well, Kwame, how can we help you grow this dope podcast? Well, we are accepting donations currently on Cash App. We always mix up the apps. Cash App and Venmo. So if you're on Cash App, the handle is $IDTALK4ED. And if you're on Venmo, the handle is going to be at Kwame SM. That's KWAMESM. Thank you kindly. All right, y'all. So this episode's special because today's guest is a really, really good friend of mine. We're talking about somebody who's been a part of this Identity Talk journey really from the beginning. She has really been someone who has come through for me over the past few years as we've grown this network, as we've grown this platform. Whenever I call on this guest, she always comes through in the clutch, and I'm just thankful to have her in the circle. She's coming here to talk with us about her new book, which is amazing. And we're going to have a good discussion today. I'm excited to have my good friend, Afrika Afeni Mills, come on to talk with us about her new book, Open Windows, Open Minds, Developing Pro-Human and Anti-Racist Students. It's a book that you all need to get, and she's going to tell you why over this next hour. So let's bring Afrika on.
Hey,
what is
everybody.
good?
Hello, and thank you so much for all your so much love for you. So much love for you. Thank you so much for that welcome. I appreciate it.
No doubt, no doubt. You know, I've had a lot of guests on this podcast. We're going on this is the 119th episode of this podcast.
Yes.
You know, and you've been here for the ride. You've seen how this thing has grown and how it's taken off. So you've played a role in that. So I definitely want to give you your flowers for doing that.
Oh, and I received them lovingly.
Awesome.
I appreciate it. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yes. So check this out. I am interviewing Afrika from Africa.
Hey, I was thinking about that. I was looking at the back and I'm just like, well, I think I know where you are.
There you go. Yes. West Side, of course. Yes, Sierra Leone.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So, of course, I know a little bit about you.
Yeah.
So you're not a stranger, of course, to this platform, but we know you are a New Yorker through and through.
Yes, absolutely.
It's in your blood.
Yep.
You sweat it, you bleed it, you cry it. It's all in you.
I do. I'll tell you really quickly. No, go ahead. I'll tell you after. Yeah.
Yeah. But outside of that, we want you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, of course, and what ultimately brought you into this education field.
Yeah. So I'll say just really quickly with regard to the New Yorker and me, my family just moved to Charlotte last September. And you should see my walls. Like there's a frame picture of like the New York City, like the train, the A train through all the way, like the letter trains all the way to the numbered trains, the IRT line, the IND, Brooklyn Bridge on the wall. I'm like, just absolute New Yorker. But to your question about like what brought me into education, when I think about school, it's actually kind of bittersweet for me right now because when I was in school, I loved school. I did really well in school. I'm going to asterisk that because I'm going to connect it to something that I've realized over the last several years. But just for what called me into education, particularly when I was in 4th and 5th grades, I looped with two of the most amazing teachers. And I think that year, those 2 years in particular, made me want to become a 4th and 5th grade classroom teacher because of the experience I had with those two teachers. So that was a school. I went to a public school in Brooklyn, a neighborhood school. It was called PS 397A, Foster Laurie, named after two slain officers. And it just was a great couple of years where it was a classroom, a school really that had very open concepts. So no walls. We didn't have any desks or chairs. We all sat on the carpet. We just really did a lot of work around reading and arts and being in musicals, and got to read Shakespeare, like not little kid versions of Shakespeare, but actual texts. And so I'm like, oh, I really enjoyed school. And I think that that's what made me connect to wanting to be a teacher and then wanting to teach those grades in particular. The bittersweet part for me, though, is like, oh, I remember why. Now, not remember because I didn't know at the time because I was a kid. I realize now why I was able to enjoy school the way that I was, because I was tracked high. So I was having these experiences that were I enjoyed them, but I didn't realize at the time that there were kids on the other side of the hallway who were not having access to the same thing that I did. So realizing that, it was very humbling and very illuminating for me. And then additionally, I'm just like, yeah, so we read Shakespeare, but that's considered a traditional part of the canon. It was not the literature we engaged with was not representative of Black and brown people really at all. And so, but to answer your question, what drew me into education were those rich years of enjoying 4th and 5th grade in particular.
All right, cool. So pretty good memories from back then.
Pretty good.
All right, cool. So in your book, you talk a lot about identity. And
Yes.
Identity is something that we focus on heavily, as seen in the title of this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
So I'm wondering, in your K-12 schooling, did you, Afrika Afeni Mills, experience any internal or external struggles with embracing who you were?
Yeah.
And then being able to show up authentically in those spaces that you're describing.
Yeah. I would say that I experienced both internal and external struggles, because for a variety of reasons. The first thing that comes to mind is having parents who were very, conscientious. You see by the name that they gave me, this is my given name. They were people who were very, very invested in learning about, and when I say Black history, I do not mean it as separate, because it is a part of United States history, even though it's treated like it's not. But my parents taught me quite a bit. And so they gave me this name, Afrika Afeni, and a beautiful name, which I know now. When I was a little kid, though, you know how it can be with children sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes if your name is unique or something that people are not used to hearing, that sometimes coming along with that can be some, teasing, bullying. So I remember going through that quite a bit, where, where my name was something that people teased me about for a long time. And so I really kind of was having a hard time feeling connected to my name. And then with regard to my identity, as, like I identify racially as a Black woman and Black child. At that point, I think about school. I feel like not only within school, but also within my family. So spreading that context out a bit to a lot of what, like, kind of the feedback that I would get from folks would be like, oh, y'all are the people in the family, like y'all think y'all are white because y'all, like because you're focused on school, or because you're, like you're in these classes and you're learning this stuff. And for me, I'm just like, that's not what I think, right? That's not how I feel. And so it was hard to feel disconnected from other kids because there was a perception that I thought that I was better than them, which I didn't, right? So there'll be a lot of like, oh, y'all think, my family, like y'all think y'all are the Jeffersons, y'all think y'all are the Huxtables. And I was like, I don't think that. I don't think that. And so there was a lot of struggle of like, having what people believed about me imposed on me, even though it wasn't something that I felt, and people not really asking me what I felt, just making some assumptions. So that happened within, like with other classmates as well. But I think that happened also with teachers, because one of the other things that was hard during my K-12 schooling, by the time I was 11, my family started going to a church that was, I'll say, being generous, I'll say it was very legalistic, but it was a cult. So my family was in a cult. So I felt even more separate from the other kids, because I'm just like, all right, so now I have this different name the kids are teasing me about, and I have these religious beliefs that are weird. And so socially, it was a big struggle for me, and my teachers had no idea that I was going through that social struggle. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you are witnessing your Black classmates dealing with their internalized trauma.
Yes.
As a result of your academic prowess.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that that's what it was now. At the time, it just felt heavy and hard. Yeah. Yeah. And I think now, honestly, when I think back at it, I'm just like, they were right to be upset. I mean, the upset feelings would have been better directed, not to me, because I think I was like, to a certain extent, like I'm in the system too. I didn't realize that I had been tracked this way. I didn't realize that tracking was a thing, because I didn't know what was happening on the other side of the hallway. Right. I just assumed that they were having the same experiences we were. I didn't know it was not. I didn't know it was not. But they were right to be upset about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's warranted then.
Yeah.
So, in saying all that, how were you able to navigate those struggles in those different K-12 school spaces you were in?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I am so grateful for is having close friends and having community. So that was such a blessing for me. And I was thinking about it where I'm just like, yeah, the friends that come to mind for me are folks who I'm still in contact with to this day. Even though we were like in elementary school together, I still have, I think social media can be problematic, but the good side of social media allows us to maintain some relationships and things like that. So really leaning into my friendships and just really like hanging out with my people, right? And being like, yeah, there's some people who are teasing me and some people who don't know me but don't like me just because, right? But I have my friends, and I'm so thankful for them. So being able to spend time with them and with their families was such a gift to me. So really being able to have that was powerful. Yeah, my friends.
Yeah. So now I want to fast forward a little bit. So you went through your K-12 schooling, college, eventually you became a teacher.
Yeah.
And you end up starting a family in the greater Boston area.
Yeah.
So that's where we first connected.
That's right.
So you had two. Yep. So we had two children who went through the system out there. And from what you've said, it sounds like they went through a lot of the same struggles you did, because they're extremely bright. Both of your children are extremely bright. They're both in college now, doing their thing.
Yep.
But back in their K-12 schooling, you had to tell some of these teachers off. So you decided, all right, I'm gonna do it the nice way and I'm gonna write a letter.
Yes.
To all the white teachers who are teaching my Black children.
Yes.
And this was a letter that you wrote for Ed Posts, but it's been in other media platforms as well.
Yeah.
And it was received pretty well by a lot of readers. Like when I read it, I felt it. Like, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
You're speaking to me. He's speaking to me right now.
Yeah.
So here's what I'm wondering. And I don't know if this is an afterthought for you But when I read that, I just thought this must be what motivated you to want to write in those open minds, because the things that you said in that article is basically the harbinger to what you ended up talking about in the book. So I want to know if that was just calculated or just happened out of coincidence.
Yeah, so I can talk about that because it actually originally appeared on the Teaching While White blog, because I had a friendship with Jennifer. Why I keep saying Jennifer? I keep calling Jennifer lately. Jenna Chandler Ward and
Chandler Ward.
and Elizabeth Denevi. And so then Ed Post published it, and then my boy, oh my gosh, I got to shout out Sharif El Mekki, right, because he put it on Philly 7th Ward, his blog, right. And so honestly, I wasn't even thinking about a book at all when I wrote that letter. That letter was genuinely coming from a place of reflecting on the experience of the intersection of all of my involvement in the teaching and learning space, right? So I am not like before I had my children, I had become an educator. But then once I have my children, I'm like, okay, so I am an educator and I am a mom who is very invested in my children having the absolute best learning experience that they can. And because I've studied education, I know what that looks like, right? So I'm like, all right, so I want to make sure that, I'm staying involved in what's happening with them in their classes and all of those things. And so when I wrote that letter, it was genuinely like just being like, okay, here are all the things that I've noticed. And here are the things that I really want to reach out and say, because at that point, that's when I first became aware of the percentage of teachers in the country who identify as white. And that it's like, I didn't realize at the time, I kind of made some assumptions based on our society. But when I found out that like 80+%, I think it's like 83 or 84% of the teachers in this country are white and primarily white women, I was like, yeah, right. So I think that was the beginnings of me thinking about, if we're really going to be able to make some headway when it comes to culturally responsive teaching and learning, we're going to have to really do something a bit different, because people are not getting what they need to do this effectively in teacher prep programs, because this is, culturally responsive teaching and learning is not necessarily something that is required to become a teacher, especially when teaching prep programs are very truncated and you don't really get to spend a lot of time in study and preparation. And so that's why I first started thinking about it. And then on top of that, I began to see those infographics that show how many the representation in children's books. So like that 2012 infographic that shows that 93% of the characters in children's books in 2012 were white. And then the very few for children of color. And then moving on to 2015, where it looked like it was getting better. But that's why data analysis is important. It wasn't quite getting better. It was went down from 93% to 73% representation of white folks in children's books. But then it was an increase in like animals and cars and trucks, and still not very much of an increase in books representing children and people of color. And so I'm like, and I feel like there's a dual role there, where publishers were not publishing. And then also to the demand, right? Like not being responsive to the demand that some of us were just like, can we please see the books, right? But just thinking about like how that was playing out between the publishing industry and also schools and all the different ways that we feed the publishing industry. And so then looking at from 2012 to 2015 and 2018, it got down to 50% of the books were about, featuring white characters. And the similar thing was happening, where you were seeing not really an increase in, representation of Black and brown people, but more so like I think the percentage went from like 12.5% up to 27% of what was the characters featured were like animals and cars and trucks. I'm like, okay, so we're seeing a shift, but we don't want to shift that over to Black and brown people. We were seeing the shift over to inanimate objects and animals. And even now on top of that, then we have this increase in book bannings across the nation that's taking place as well. So I was like, yeah, in order for us to do this work well, we really need to take a look at what's happening with white students. And since most of the people who are teaching students are also white folks who did not have these learning experiences when they were in school, then we have to do a dual piece of work. Get that work in for the teachers, and then so that they can provide something different for the students.
And then this leads me to your book, Open Windows, Open Minds. Yeah. So as soon as I saw the title, immediately I thought Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Because when she talks about windows and mirrors, how
Mhm.
our Black and brown students need windows and mirrors in order to see reflections of who they are, so
Mhm.
they can aspire to be these characters and see
Mhm.
the possibilities of who
Mhm.
they can be.
Yeah.
The way he spun it and how he came to this title.
Yep. So I definitely want to give props to, because, like when you're going through the writing process and trying to think about like, what is the title that's going to capture the essence of what, the idea that you're putting forward. I was just like, well, what is it? Because I knew that I really wanted to build it on the concept of windows and mirrors, because I'm like, all right, so if the culturally responsive part of our work is coming from the fact that Black and brown kids are seeing far too many windows and not nearly enough mirrors in the representation that they're experiencing in their learning experiences within schools, then what is the flip side of that, right? Is that white students are seeing, and that's what's depicted in those infographics, white students are seeing way too many mirrors and not nearly enough windows. And not only that, but like even what it is that they are seeing is distorted, right? And so we can talk a little bit about that too. But I was like, all right, so what does it mean, right? What does it mean to need to provide more windows for white kids? And I'm like, to me, I'm like, I have some. For me, I'm like, we have so much work to do, and I'm like, we can't play these games with these words that we use, and a lot of times we put these deficit-based like narratives on Black and brown kids where we talk about, and I know you've heard it too, right? Talk about Black and brown kids being at risk and all of these things. And I'm like, for me, legit, looking at what is happening currently in this country and what has happened in this country over centuries, I'm like, white kids are at risk, right? When we're thinking about the things that we're seeing when it comes to like and I'm like, I think like the most pronouncing that we see that tends to catch attention, unfortunately, is when we see these racially motivated shootings and when there's a loss of life, a lot of times happening at the hands of young white men. I'm like, yeah, that like whatever is feeding that type of ideology, whatever is, and then even if someone doesn't get to the point of taking their ideology and violently taking the lives of people who are different from them, there are a bunch of folks who just, when we're thinking about like how we're voting, how we're making decisions, who we support, what ideas we support, all the systems that exist in this country. I'm like, yeah, we really have to get to the heart of the heart of what's happening here so we can interrupt it. And so that's what's really behind like the title of the book. It's like we need to be able to create the conditions under which white folks are having the opportunity to engage in what it looks like to be anti-racist, but not only anti-racist, but also pro-human.
So essentially, if we can get white folks and really all folks to see the different representations of Black and brown people, that will therefore open their minds to see that, hey, all these racialized stereotypes that we've been hearing,
yes,
they're really not true.
That's right. That's exactly right.
They're just
And I
false
think
narratives.
they really are. And so I'm like, and that's why I give the shout out to Karen Sakaguchi. I always will give her props because she was one of the people who contributed to the book, and she was the one who recommended that title. And I fell in love with it as soon as I'm like, this is perfect because it has the dual meaning, right? That we are describing that, that open windows lead to open minds, and we're looking at the fact, right? The fact of open windows and open minds and the connection to those two things. And so absolutely. So it's not, and to me, I'm like, it's not only about getting to know Black and brown folks for yourself, not from what the media tells you, not from what the people in your segregated community and spaces have misinformed you or misrepresented, but for yourself. You are, you're able to continue on the natural curiosity that children have from the time that they enter the world, and not interrupt that, but continue to have them learn about everybody, they're not just having themselves reflected back to themselves. And, because I feel like that's very destructive, but it's also too, the other piece of it is that, like, because I got this concept from Jenna and Elizabeth from Teaching While White, is that white students in particular need to see the representations of whiteness that are in solidarity, freedom dreaming, that are abolitionists, right? And so I'm like, so yeah, you know, all the people screaming out right now being like, oh, the children are going to be made to feel ashamed and they're going to be indoctrinated. I'm like, I know what indoctrination looks like. This is not it. We know what indoctrination looks like, so we can have that conversation as well, right? If we really want to. But for me, I'm just like, yeah, if you want to just tell kids the only way possible for you as a white identifying person is as a colonizer or as an oppressor, that if that's the only option, but that's not the only option, right? You can be an abolitionist, you can be a freedom fighter, right? We have examples of white folks who've done that work too. And I feel like most of the time we don't, like, white kids don't get to hear about Jane Elliott. White kids don't hear about like William Lloyd Garrison and James Tyson, who Bettina Love talks about, like working with supporting Bree Newsom to take down the Confederate flag. So that's it too. Like, they need to see the other possibilities of what it means to be a white person.
Do you also talk about Peggy McIntosh?
Oh, I haven't named her, but absolutely, like thinking about, she talked about unpacking that invisible knapsack. Yeah. So Peggy, that's a resource that Jenna and Elizabeth created as well. It's part of their book because they have a book that came out too, and then it's also on the blog as well. A whole list of white anti-racist activists. Yeah.
All right, awesome. So let's stay on that for a second, because clearly you are an unapologetic Black woman.
Yes.
Who is writing a book primarily to white educators.
Yes.
So I'm just thinking, as you are going through this process, you are probably thinking to yourself, man, I gotta be me. I gotta make sure that what I write about is authentic.
Yes.
Speaks my truth.
Yes.
Without worrying about how these white folks are gonna feel. Forget the fragility, forget these tears. They gonna hear this from me. Now, Toni Morrison back in the day talked about how she worked so hard not to write in the white gaze.
Yes.
And there's actually an interview she did years ago where she talks about it in depth. If anybody goes on YouTube, you should be able to find that. It's a very classic interview. Now, this is a two-part question. So here's the first part. What are your thoughts about books that talk about anti-racism, anti-bias, diversity, equity, inclusion, that are written in this white gaze? What are your feelings about it? Do you feel like there's a space for it? Do you feel like it does more harm than good? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I definitely, first of all, want to shout out, like, I know that video you're talking about and part in the interview you're talking about, because one of the people that I most admire in this space, Chris Emden, I've had an opportunity to learn from him multiple times. And so
Shout out Dr. Emden.
Absolutely. I have so much love for him. And one of the things when I in one of his sessions that I had to that I had the privilege of being a part of and the gift of being a part of, he showed that clip where she talks about the white gaze. I had never seen it before, and I had never heard that phrase before. He showed it in that space. And so for me, when I think about this work, right, like when, you know, especially when it comes to like the white gaze, I'm like, oh, you know what that is, right? Like if anybody has seen Get Out, I'm like, oh, that's the sunken place, right? That's the sunken place, right? When there's trying to be like, when there's a lens around like a looking at this work from the perspective of not necessarily talking about like, how do we actively interrupt this thing, right? And seeing how really pressing it is to interrupt. And so one of the pieces that I bring to mind, like it comes to mind for me as you ask that question, is that part of the effort of this book is to interrupt the white gaze, right? Is to make sure that that doesn't continue to be a thing. And so I think that that's a big part of the work that we need to do, because when like the way I think about the white gaze is like this gaze of, okay, just really focusing in on whiteness and maybe, you know, like kind of what happened a few years ago when there was someone in Starbucks who called the police on Black men who were just sitting there waiting to have a meeting, right? And Starbucks's response was like, we're going to have lots of anti-bias training, and because we really need to know we're human beings, and we all categorize, and we all, we all sort things out in our brains, and it's natural, and all of that stuff. And then when we had, all of the things that happened around, like Ahmaud Arbery being murdered, and Breonna Taylor being murdered, and George Floyd being murdered, so many people were putting up the black square and saying like, our Black Lives Matter. I'm just like, yes, what does that mean to you, right? And so when I think about the white gaze, it's about like maintaining a certain level of comfort and safety. And I'm like, there really isn't comfort in this work, right? This work is uncomfortable because there have been awful things that human beings have done to one another for such a long period of time. And so for me, absolutely unapologetically direct about the work that we need to do. And then also mindful too about, like, as human beings, we need to have the tools to do this work. It can't just be trying to call things out and trying to identify like what we're seeing. That's part of it. But then we also need to say, well, what are we going to do about this, right? And so when we think about the white gaze, it's not about like creating a space where we're just naming things without the interruption and without the restructuring of our society and all of the things that feed it. It's about it. Yeah, it can't be light. This is not light work. This is very serious work.
And I think with the white gaze, it's one of those things where, yes, it's problematic, but when you really look at it, it could really serve as a scaffold for white folks.
Yes.
And here's what I mean by that.
Yep.
Like, I look at a book like any of Robin DiAngelo's books, whether you're talking about white fragility or night racism. A lot of great information in there.
Right.
It's a book that I still recommend to people, particularly those who are totally oblivious to their whiteness. Totally oblivious about their whiteness and how they show up. Like, here, this is a book you need to start off with.
Yes.
I'm not going to give you Layla Said, Me and White Supremacy, because that might hurt your soul. Although I feel like you need to hear that. Maybe you're not ready for it. You feel what I'm saying?
Yes.
So I think there is a space for the white gaze, even How to Be an Anti-Racist with Ibram Kendi.
Yeah.
That's white gaze. If you really read it closely, he's defining terms that we know as Black folk to like, oh, this is what this means. And this Ebonics term, this is what this means.
Right.
Just because you don't know.
Yeah.
That's white gaze right there.
Yeah. And I think, and like you're saying too, like to a certain extent, there's a bridge that needs to be there, right? Like if this is you're saying, like you're completely unaware. And I think about this, I'm just like, if I'm a white person, say I'm a white kid born into a community that is all white, and everybody in my place of worship is white, everybody in my sports teams are white, like all my family is white, and like and the only time I really see Black and brown people is in a lot of misrepresentations in the media and what other people are saying to me about Black and brown people. It is fully possible to grow up in that way and have no true awareness of the world, the realities of the world, and the history of how we gotten to this point, and to really think like, why are people complaining? And like, enslavement was a long time ago, and people are free, and why are we still talking? We're post-racial, right? And I think like underneath this last like few years, I think people be like, oh, well, maybe we're wrong because it's been buck wild in this country over the last like several years in particular. But even with that, it's just like, okay, so when you notice that something is wrong, you can't just notice it and just be like, oh, that's terrible, I wish that it was different. We have to actively recreate something, because otherwise we're going to get more of the same, right? So I agree with you, like there needs to be a bridge for something that's just like any of us, right? If we're learning something new, if I'm learning a new language, if I'm learning how to play an instrument, if I'm learning how to play a sport, I don't know how to do it yet. So we got to get some fundamentals, right? I got to be able to be introduced to it. And then with practice, I'm going to get better, but I got to keep going. I can't just get the introduction class and be like, yeah, thank you for that, I'm good. Like, no, you have to keep going, right? To be fluent, to be good at what you do. You can't just look at it. You got to get dirty. Yeah, you got to get dirty.
Yeah, you got to get dirty, got to get messy, for sure, for sure.
Yes.
And what I also like about your book is, particularly the title of the book, is that I feel like over the past few years, we've really watered down this anti-racist term.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so watered down to the point that it's lost its effectiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you have it in your subtitle, but
Yep.
you also have the word pro-human, which I
Yes.
think is even more powerful. And I think that should be the goal for all of us, because ultimately, when we're doing anti-racist work, the focus should be on looking at the humanity,
Absolutely.
humanizing people around us. So
Yes.
I really want you to talk more about your choice in putting that term pro-human in the subtitle and why
Yes.
you were so intentional about doing that, because I think that's powerful.
Thank you. So I definitely want to give, like, it's important to me to give props where props are due, right? And so I mentioned, I really mentioned Chris Emden as someone who is very influential to me. And I also want to name James Ford as well. Like, he is someone, James Ford is someone who I had the blessing of meeting a number of years ago, where he was presenting. He I believe was the 2014 North Carolina State Teacher of the Year. And so I have a friend who I'm going to talk about a little bit later who brought me into that space. I had a chance to hear James talk. And this was, I think it might have been in 2018. And he said, which I will always stick with me, we can't spend so much time thinking about what we want to tear down that we don't talk about what we want to build. And I was like, yo, that's so true, right? Because if we dismantle something that needs to be dismantled, then absolutely, right? But what are we creating in its place? We don't want to leave a vacuum, right? And so what is it that we're dreaming of? And so we need to be able to do both. So that stuck in my mind from then. And then even this past, before I had even gotten to the point of like really narrowing down the title, I had a chance to be in another space with Chris Emden, and he talked about that. Well, he's like, a lot of people talking about anti-racism. He's like, not to say that that's a bad thing, but he said something similar to what James had said several years before, where he was saying, we if we're thinking about what we're against, right? If that's the sole focus of what it is that we're doing, then where is the space to talk about what it is that what we are for and what we want to build? And so I was like, all right, yes, that's true. That's facts, right? It was a whole mood when he said that. So it was really, really illuminating for me. So I'm like, so how do we capture that? So I'm like, so what is it, right? Like, if we're anti-racism and we're wanting to be against that, what are we for? And so I'm like, so we're pro-human, right? Because all of us are people, and we deserve to be treated in the dignity and all the brilliance that we hold, all the beauty and the complexity that exists within all of us. We need to be able to really lean into that. And that's something, like, for me, when I think about students, because the work really has to be about kids, I think about, kids who are like, when they're 4 or 5 years old, and they're, like, no baby comes out of the womb, with these thoughts, right? That's that Nelson Mandela quote where it talks about no child, comes into the world just like knowing how to hate. That's something that's taught, right? So a lot of times you see kids and they're just like, they just have questions like, oh, asking an adult in their lives, like, oh, why does that person have a brown face or whatever? Because kids just have questions that they should have answered. And a lot of times, because we don't have these conversations, the adults in their lives may not know how to answer, so they just shush the children. And that's something that Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about as well, is that we need to be able to answer their questions. And so I'm like, I believe that if we approach instruction from a pro-human standpoint and just really teach kids and answer their questions and allow them to engage in curiosity and wonder, and not make it something that we're trying to block or to put warning labels on or to ban, right? That they get to have the opportunity to grow up learning about the people in our human family without an interruption. So that's really why that's what's behind the word pro-human for me.
Yes, powerful. And I think if more of us just focused on that alone,
Yes.
maybe that will be enough to reframe our thinking around all the things we're trying to do.
Yes. Right.
The legislation that is out there, banning books that are pro-human,
Right.
putting out legislation that's pro-human.
Right.
Whether we're talking about legislation that advocates for the rights of trans people and other people in the LGBTQ plus community,
Yes.
whether we're just talking about anything that just deals with culturally relevant curriculum.
Yes.
This is all pro-human, but we've been saying this for years. We've had
Oh,
scholars saying this for years.
totally.
You know what I mean?
Right?
Like Karji Woodson was saying this right
Decades
before
ago.
we had a Black History Month.
Right?
Like
Right?
this isn't new stuff.
It
We're
really
just
is.
recycling things that we've been saying for many, many generations. It's just a shame that we're in 2022 and we still have to have this conversation.
Yeah, and the thing I was going to say too, and part of the reason why I'm just like, yeah, that's why we have to get kids young and get them thinking critically, right? So they can be asking these hard questions. Because one of the first things I did when I started seeing the list of banned books, especially the one that originally I think they ended up backtracking because there was such an outcry against it. But there was I think it was a 4-page list from Central York, Pennsylvania, of the books that they were going to ban.
Oh,
and
wow.
they were like, when I say 4 pages, like in a small font. So there was just pages and pages of books. And I'm like, let me take a look and see what's on there, Kwame. The books that were on there, I'm like, what? Why is this? Okay, so you don't want kids to learn about Nelson Mandela. You don't want them to learn about Malala Yousafzai, right? You don't want kids to read a book called Max and the Tagalong Moon, which is just like a 5-year-old Black boy who thinks the moon is following him. Or the book, or like even the book Jacqueline Woodson wrote called The Other Side, where a Black girl and a white girl figure out how to play together on the fence, even though they're told they can't cross the fence. Like these books that are being banned are, it's like, it's not like, you're not even worried about indoctrination. You just don't want any Black and brown characters or representation in the literature at all. That's what was clear to me. And so I'm like, that's very, very disturbing. So we have to interrupt. We have to interrupt. And we need white kids to know to ask those questions too, right? It can't just be some of us asking the questions. All of us need to be asking those questions. Like, why are you banning this book? What is offensive to you about this content?
So this question just came to my mind as I was thinking.
Yeah.
Now, being born in American society, automatically we're indoctrinated. That's just how I feel.
Yeah.
Because everything is revolving around white dominant culture.
Yep.
So if that's the default, here's my question. Do you believe that white folks view what we're doing, the work that we're doing, as indoctrination because they themselves don't realize that by being white, that's a racialized identity?
Yes, I totally believe it. I mean, because that's the thing too, right? Like so many conversations that we can have about that, but just like growing up, being white, but not thinking of themselves as having a race, right? Even though we know race is a social construct, but just in the sake of this conversation, right? Like not, and just thinking like, oh, this is not white, this is normal, right? Like, so when we see every representation, the names on keychains in those amusement parks, all the different, the content in our classrooms, the representations of emojis in our phones where we got to, like, if you're a brown person, you got to reselect something different. Like, it's
just to be clear, our names ain't gonna be on them keychains.
Oh, totally not. You see, I was looking for a long time. Never found it, right? And so just like thinking about that, like, okay, when we look at the description of the color nude, if this doesn't match somebody else's skin color, then who is that nude for? We're normalizing a certain type of skin tone, right? And so, yeah, we're totally indoctrinated. And so I think that's why it feels really ironic when I'm feeling the most generous. When we hear people talking about indoctrination, I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, let's really define indoctrination and talk about what that actually looks like, right? That looks like, because for me as a kid, I remember growing up and my parents being like, no, you're not allowed to pledge allegiance to the flag. You're not allowed to sing the national anthem. 4th of July, like we do like having cookouts and stuff. But for me, as I grew up learning about Juneteenth, right, is this like really thinking about like, why might, instead of being like, oh, you're unpatriotic, the question should be like, oh, if you don't feel comfortable singing that or saying the pledge, why? And I'm like, I will tell you, this whole land of the free, home of the brave thing is not ringing true for many of us, right? And all of these things, like I'm not, these things that you're having children reciting in schools, this is not true for everybody. And actually, when people even think about founding fathers, a lot of us don't really even know like the truth about like the founding fathers. It's more coming out. People are being more aware of it. now. But yeah, there's so much that needs to be taught. So much that needs to be taught.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Whew.
Yeah.
So I got just a couple more questions before we get into this lightning round. So
Okay.
here's the next one. So over the past few months, I've been really thinking deeply about this work that we do.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about white dominant culture,
Mm-hmm.
and more specifically, just this idea of intersectionality
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how we view identity, the 3 P's keep coming up for me:
Yeah.
privilege, positionality, and
Mm-hmm.
power.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I want to know from you, how do you believe those 3 P's influence the work that we do in trying to create those inclusive spaces in our classrooms?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. For me, the first thing that comes to mind, and it's a massive shift that needs to take place, is thinking about, first of all, being aware of our own privilege, our own positionality, and our own power. So for me, as someone who identifies as a Black woman, I'm like, okay, so those parts of my identity, I see where the injustices are. I see what oppression is. I've experienced it personally. I witness it, right? And then also when I think about other parts of my identity where I do experience privilege or positionality, acknowledging that positionality, empower myself. I'm like, okay, so how am I, like, when we look at that breakdown of like white supremacy culture, I'm like, how is this stuff showing up in me, right? Like, how is it showing up in me when I'm thinking about, about my able-bodied privilege, or if I'm thinking about my privilege as someone who is a Christian, or if I'm thinking about like heterosexist privilege or cisgender privilege and things like that. So I think like really being aware of our own privilege, positionality, and power is really essential. And then when it comes specifically into the classroom, as educators, we really need to flip the whole way that we approach that space, because when we think about the origins of education, and I'm doing air quotes for that, because in this country, when public education began, it was not intended to be what we know it should be, right? It was very much like factory based and level, tracking kids and steering some kids toward jobs and steering some kids toward higher education, and a lot of it was like very male centered in the beginning and not really focused on on up, like who, if you're not male, right, if you're not white, those opportunities weren't even available for you. So we need to really take a good look at the origins that we built this system on, and then to be able to say that doesn't work and it's not considerate of any student or any teacher, really, right? Because that's not really an education, like a flow of a learning relationship. And so just really being able to say, if I'm experiencing privilege, if my position gives me some advantage in some way, if I have any type of power, then how do I recognize that? And then how do I leverage it to make sure that those who should have it, who are not given access to it, do have access to it? So that looks like restructuring the way our classrooms are. It looks like not really focusing so much on like classroom management and controlling kids and trying to get students to be compliant. It looks like us really thinking about like, what is the learning process and how do we engage students in like creativity and critical thoughts and idea generation, right? Like, how do we make sure that we're getting to really recognize the brilliance that they bring in and we are helping them to hone that? That's what learning really is. And so I think it's really a restructuring of how we think about school, right? And not that control piece. Because I think even when I became a teacher, one of the main things that I feel like was driven home for me is like, make sure your kids are controlled, that they're quiet, that they're sitting at their desks. Maybe you can group them together in groups so they're not by themselves. But mainly it's like if somebody comes in to observe you, you want to make sure the kids are engaged and attentive. But it wasn't even like true engagement. It was like that they looked like they were paying attention. That's not really learning though. So I think a lot of like those 3 P's have to like should be what motivates us to flip the way that we engage in learning spaces and make sure that the kids or the students in our classrooms they're experiencing those things as well, that they understand their power, that they understand their agency. And that's why I don't even like the word empower, because I'm like, I'm not giving that to you. You already have it. But let's help you to recognize how to leverage those things as you grow and contribute in the community as well.
All right. And I feel like if we just focus on those identifiers,
Mm-hmm.
right,
Mm-hmm.
it takes away from all the attention that we put on just race.
Yes.
It's like, no, it's bigger than race.
Massively bigger than race.
It's bigger than it. And you
Yeah.
start to realize how relative these terms are. Like,
Mhm.
you could be
Mhm.
in one space and have privilege and positionality. You could be in a different space and not have it.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Like, it's not the same wherever you go, and that's why there's a constant awareness that has to take place. And I feel like if we as educators are aware of
Mhm.
who we are, how our students view us when they
Mhm.
look at us every
Mhm.
single day, and
Yes.
how sometimes our actions can trigger certain emotions.
Yes.
Like, there's a power that comes with just knowing who you are and just how that comes off to your students and even your
Yeah.
colleagues in the building.
Right. Right. And that's the piece too. Like, I mean, I think people have given throughout my whole time, I've been an educator for over 20 years, and people have always given name to like, it's really important to build relationships with students. But I'm like, yeah, but we spend so little time actually really learning how to do that well and effectively. Like, what does that really mean? It doesn't mean just giving out a random survey at the beginning of the school year and then tucking it away in a drawer and then just doing whatever we plan to do and whatever our agenda is, right? It's so much more than that. And when we have those relationships with our students, when we can build a trusting learning community where we see that the learning is mutual, right? My students, like, they teach me so much. It's not just like I'm pouring all of my knowledge into them. This is it when done well, as far as I'm concerned, there's a mutuality there, right? And
Mm.
if you like to me, I feel like if educators don't feel like they have something to learn from students and from their families and the communities in which the students are and the schools are, then that's such a detrimental perspective because there's so much to learn from one another.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And as we continue to go down this journey, of being pro-human and
Mm-hmm.
anti-racist,
Mm-hmm.
there are always things that we continue to grow in. There's
Yes.
always those areas that we see that we're not as knowledgeable on, or we just
Right.
need to build our capacity in.
Yes.
So I want to take this time to give you the floor to just share what are those areas where you feel like you're still continuing to grow
Mm-hmm.
in your practice, and how are you addressing those areas so you can be more inclusive and more pro-human in your
Yes.
work?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked that question because I'm like, I think that humility and vulnerability is so important and to be able to share where we're still working through some things. And that's why I'm like, a lot of times people will refer to me as like, oh, Afrika Afeni Mills expert. I'm like, nah, I'm like, I'm a learner. I'm going to be learning forever. Like, I know some things. I don't know all the things though. So I'll name a couple that come to mind for me immediately is, first of all, thinking about within folks of color. I think a lot of times that we have conversations about what's happening like within the white gaze or with white supremacy or white supremacy culture, but don't often spend time thinking about how that shows up between us, right? And so I
Mm,
think about that, like my big learning over the last several years has been about my understanding of indigenous native folks. Because I'm like, I had I didn't realize it, but I had like no understanding until I would say within the past, like maybe 4 or 5 years. I still I think a lot of people in this country were thinking about like, oh yeah, sure, Thanksgiving and pilgrims and Indians sat together and had a good meal. I'm just like, okay, that's that's what was, that's what I saw in school. That's what was put out into my textbooks. But then as I started to really learn more, I'm just like, oh, that is a totally false narrative. There were some horrific things that happened, and I really need to know what those things are. And I would say specifically, as a Black person who thought a lot about reparations and 40 acres and a mule and what those of us who are descended from enslaved Africans deserved, that recently, within, I would say probably the last year, I started to think, I'm like, wait, 40 acres, 40 of whose acres and what mule? Like, where was the land that we were supposed to have been given going to come from? It was going to be, if we had received it, which we didn't, it was going to be land that was stolen from indigenous folks. And so I'm just like, all right, so there's a lot that I need to learn about even other folks of color, right? Because there's a lot that goes on between us that we really need to
yeah.
address as well, right? Within us and between us. And then the other thing I'll say too is just really thinking about able body privilege, and this is like I say this stuff and I'm like not proud of it, but I need to, like, it's important for me to get it out there because I'm like, that's where we grow and learn. When I was posting something on LinkedIn, and there was a prompt that came up asking, did I want to enter alternative text? And I was like, what does that mean? Like, I had not really seen that. I had seen like other people starting to enter, but I didn't really know what it was. And then I was just like, my initial response, like my gut response was, I'm trying to just put this post out here real quick. I don't really know what this is. This is something I feel like I want to skip. Then I was like, wait, right? Because I'm like, I can't, like, to me, I'm like, it's important to be authentic. And I'm like, if this is what I really believe, if I believe in being pro-human, the pause should be, my intention was to post this. There's clearly something I need to learn here. So let me wait to post it until I learn what this opportunity is offering and to figure that out. And the thing about it was, like, it's not much. It's just describe the image, right? It's not asking for, it's not asking for a lot from me, but because it's not something that I require, it's so easy to dismiss, right? And just be like, no, my agenda is to do X, right? So when it comes to, like, understanding, like, even amongst us as Black and brown folks, and then even to someone who experiences able-bodied privilege, like, how do I slow myself down to apply the things that I say that I believe in? So those are some things that I'm working on right now.
No, that's real, especially when you talk about indigenous nations.
Yes.
Not just in this country, but even in Canada, just North America in general.
Right.
My first understanding of settler colonialism came, real talk, maybe a year and a half ago.
Yeah, that's me too, within the past several years.
When somebody lovingly called me out, and I'm gonna shout her out. I'm gonna shout out Trisha Mokino.
Okay.
If y'all know Trisha Mokino, y'all need
She
to go check out
Embracing Equity.
Yep.
Yeah, I know
that Trisha. Embracing
yes.
Equity, Trisha. Shout out to Trisha. She's the real one.
Yes.
She pulled me to the side virtually and was like, hey, I love the work that you do, but here's how what you said is bringing harm to me and to my people.
Yeah.
And, she came on this podcast and we had a good conversation where, she educated me about settler colonialism. She educated me about just the boarding schools.
Yes.
And just how even us as Black folks, we're settler colonizers.
Yes.
Because we're occupying unceded land.
Yes.
Which is the reason why everybody wants to do a land acknowledgement.
Right.
Which that alone is becoming performative. Like, all right, let's get past that. But we could talk about that another time. But but in a nutshell, Trisha Mokino, if you're listening to this, thank you.
Yes.
Because I've learned so much since then, and I've been able to interview more people from different indigenous nations who have given me their perspective and just given me more game about, what it is. So
yeah, and for me, I want to shout out Claudia Fox-Tree, who was my person. Yeah, she was and is my person because she's so, brilliant, so generous, so just like, offers so much. And in a way that's like you were saying too, like what Trisha did with you, it's like, it's an invitation. It's not like, oh, I can't believe you said that kind of thing. It's like, you probably didn't know. Let me let you know. Right. And that's how we know better and we do better. Right. Yeah.
I think for me, the new term or the new area that I'm really digging into now is just neurodiversity.
Yes.
Which I think hits close to home because I actually started my first 4 years of school with an IEP.
Okay.
And, to this day, I'm still a slow processor when it comes to just getting thoughts together. Even when I'm trying to write articles for these different platforms, where I'm trying to think about questions for this podcast, where I'm trying to do just daily things.
Yeah.
It takes me a little bit longer to do it.
Right.
And I've come to the point where I've embraced that.
Yes. I love that.
But if I was in a school setting, they'll look at me like, okay, something's wrong with you.
Yes, very deficit.
Let's
Very deficit.
evaluate you for an IEP. We're not even
Yes.
going to do RTI.
Mm-mm.
Forget tier 1. Let's get up to tier 1,000 so you can go ahead into the self-contained room.
Isolate you. Yes,
You,
going to isolate
you
you.
know what I'm saying?
Yes, I totally do.
Like, but I say neurodiversity because, I was in a school where we had students who had autism,
Yes.
students who had ADHD, students who were dyslexic, students who
Mm-hmm.
had dysgraphia.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were some of the brightest students I've ever taught.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right.
But
Right.
yet, when other people see them, they see something different. So for me, I'm more interested in just the brain science of it
Same.
and how we can incorporate that into the work that we do.
Right. Right.
Because if you think about it, when you think about neurodiversity versus neurotypical
Mm-hmm.
humans,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
That's another layer of that dominant culture right there.
It really
That's
is.
another layer
Right.
that we are just barely scratching.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that's the piece too, where it's like, but I go back to this a lot because it's how those of us who are in classrooms, depending on what context you're in, sometimes you can become a teacher in certain schools without necessarily having gone through some type of prep program. But it's like, I had like one class about like special education. That was one of my required classes, but it wasn't like and this was a long time ago. So there's also that. But I was like, yeah, just thinking about like when I became an actual practitioner, one of the biggest things was like, yes, you need to know how to differentiate instruction. And I'm just like, I hear you saying that. What does that mean? And what does that look like? And so really being able to like, I hear that a lot. Even, and I think maybe this happens with you too, when I'm talking to some adults. This happened the other day where I was having a conversation with someone who was like, when I was in school, I was a bad student or I was bad at school. And I'm like, you weren't bad. You weren't getting what you needed, right? It's not a reflection on you, even though that's how we make it out to be. It's like if a student is not having a good experience, we don't put that on them, right? Because we need to be able to make sure they have everything available to them to have the experience that they deserve to have, even if it's not what we like what it is that we were expecting or what we were trained to do.
And then just one last thing about neurodiversity, which I think is why it's so important. One, you talked about differentiation, which is something that we all hear about.
Yes. Yes.
We also hear about things like UDL, Universal Design for Learning.
Yes.
You need to apply that in the classroom.
Yes.
But yet, when it comes time for April and May, we're all taking the same test.
Yes.
It's normed.
Right.
So we're not accounting for brain processing.
No.
You mean to tell me that there are certain students who may not even get extra time to complete this exam?
Right.
And that is for those who may not be fortunate enough to get a 504 plan
Exactly.
or an IEP to get that accommodation.
Right. Right.
And that's another topic in itself, how our special education system is flawed in many ways. How so many kids, Black and brown kids, go through the cracks.
Yep.
So that's one instance. But then the other instance is pacing, scope and sequence.
Because we got to cover this content by this date, right?
You know what I'm saying? But
yes,
it's like, how can you provide this hard deadline of days and not account for the processing speeds of students in terms of the information they're taking in? You gotta account for that. You gotta account for that.
Right, because that's the difference between like where I was talking, the same conversation I was making reference to earlier was like, yeah, we're talking about like, are we trying to just get students to memorize things and regurgitate things that they actually don't comprehend or actually own? Like they know it's not theirs, right? We're just getting them to be performative, really. Or do we want to see if they comprehend it? And if it's about comprehension, then we really need to approach this very differently. Right. So why are we timing things? And why are we stuck to a pacing guide if we really want to be responsive to learners? Those things don't go together. They're diametrically opposed. right? Yeah. Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
But we could talk about that
We
forever.
could.
For real. So as we wind down, we want to get into the lightning round to close things out.
Yeah.
So first question I have for you. What are you doing these days for self-care? How do you
Yes.
remain sane?
Yeah. So for me, a couple of things. One is that I started like morning and evening, like a waking and a settling for the night, like meditative practice has been so good for me because my mind is a busy mind, right? And sometimes it can be really hard for me to just rest and to just be and not to be producing. And so really that's been really helpful for me lately. And I'm someone who really invest in massage. Like I really do. Like I believe in massage therapy, and as often as I can because I'm like I really believe that like we got to take care of our bodies, right?
Yes.
And so I'm a very big proponent of massage when I have access to it.
All right, cool.
Mm-hmm.
When you walk into any room, what song's playing in the background?
Okay, now that's hard because I love music. I really do. So I was struggling. I'm just like, it might be like Already or Break My Soul by Beyonce because I'm really loving like the Lion King soundtrack for Already and Break My Soul's
All
vibing with
right.
me, right?
Should
But
we do
I'm actually
should
gonna
we do
choose.
scenarios?
I think yeah, I really like part of me is like I really like there's a song called Africa, spelled with a K, just like my name by Amanda Black, featuring Adankule Gold. I love that song, and I'm like, it just would be perfect to walk into that because I'm like, it's spelled with a K. It's a beautiful song, has a lot of energy, and I'm like, yeah, that's the one I settle on. Yeah,
All right, cool.
yeah.
If you can invite 3 influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be?
All right, so for me, I so fangirl Ava DuVernay. I'm like, one day I got to be able to meet Ava because I think she's a brilliant filmmaker. So if I had a chance to have dinner with her, that would be incredible. One of my favorite musicians is Jill Scott. And so I need to have dinner with Jill. I've had dreams that me and Jill were hanging out. So I'm like, that's how deep it goes for me. And so I really would like to be able to have, to have a meal with Jill Scott and Oprah Winfrey. I'm like, I really feel like I want to have, that's another person I had a dream about meeting, right? And that I really would like to be able to have a conversation with her because I really do appreciate how she engages in conversation with folks. So if I could have dinner with those 3 folks, that would be an absolute gift to me.
Cool. All right,
Yeah.
one last question here. Who would you like to see as a guest on this podcast?
Oh, for me, hands down, my girl, Monica Washington. She is someone who, like, she is such a good friend. Like, for me, she's family. And she and I, like, we spent a lot of time on the road going around to different conferences around the country, presenting together about culturally responsive teaching and diversifying the literature that students are engaging with and what it looks like to be equitable in the classroom. And she's just amazingly brilliant. She was the 2014 Texas State Teacher of the Year. And she just is like, she has so much, like, so humble, but she absolutely just exudes so much brilliance, so much love for kids, and such respect for teachers. And she's in, like, there's some work that she's about to take on that I think will be wonderful for you to talk to her about. And so Monica Washington, hands down.
Cool. So
Yeah.
we're gonna have to connect then.
Yes. Yes.
For sure. All right. Well, Afrika, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been awesome. Always a good time to rap with you.
Absolutely.
And before you leave us, please let people know how they can connect with you on social media and also direct them to your website as well and the book.
Okay. All right. So just the name of the book again is Open Windows, Open Minds, Developing Anti-Racist Pro-Human Students. You can connect with me on my website, which is afrikaafenimills.com. And you can find lots of information there as well. On Twitter, my handle is @Afeni On Instagram and on Facebook, Open Windows, Open Minds, they both have their own pages. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Afrika Afeni Mills as well. So lots of different ways to connect with me, and I genuinely love connecting with folks.
All right, y'all heard it. Make sure y'all get the book, Open Windows, Open Minds, and also connect with Afrika. Have her come to your school, do a keynote, do a workshop,
Yes.
She gonna come with that heat.
It's gonna be love. It's gonna be a loving heat. Loving heat.
There you go. A loving heat. That's right.
Loving heat. Yes.
Loving heat. There you
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
All right, Africa. So until next time, we're gonna wrap.
Okay.
All right. Right, y'all. So we're gonna end another awesome episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, people, I'm wishing you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.